Once she's in a nursing home, we can finally sell this place and start our real life, my son's fiancée whispered, followed by the kind of laughter that doesn't belong in a home filled with memories. I froze in the narrow hallway outside the kitchen, my hand still resting on the light switch, as if even the smallest movement might shatter whatever fragile illusion I had left about my family. The late afternoon sun was slipping through the blinds in thin golden stripes, cutting across the worn hardwood floor that Daniel had once learned to crawl on, and for a moment I wondered if I had somehow misunderstood what I had just heard. At 72, you learn to doubt your ears before you doubt your child. I stood there listening to the murmur of their voices, the soft clink of wine glasses, the casual tone of people discussing something as ordinary as repainting a bedroom or planning a weekend trip, except they were talking about my life, my future, my home. She won't fight it, Ashley said lightly. She barely keeps up with the stairs now. We'll tell her it's for her own good. Daniel chuckled, the same warm laugh that used to echo through this house on Christmas mornings, and that sound pierced me more sharply than any harsh word ever could. I remembered him at 5 years old, wrapped in a blanket on the living room couch, insisting he wasn't afraid of thunderstorms even as he clutched my hand. I remembered teaching him how to drive in the empty parking lot of the old grocery store down the street, his knuckles white on the steering wheel, his voice trembling with excitement. I had spent decades believing that love, if given freely and consistently, would circle back to you when you needed it most. Now I stood invisible just a few feet away, listening to plans being made to erase me from the only place that had ever truly felt like mine. The kitchen smelled faintly of rosemary and roasted chicken, a dinner I had prepared hours earlier because Daniel had said they were stopping by to discuss wedding details. I had even polished the silverware, the good set my late husband Thomas and I bought on our 20th anniversary, convinced that small gestures still mattered in keeping a family close. Through the crack in the doorway I could see Ashley leaning against the counter, her manicured fingers wrapped around a glass of Chardonnay, her engagement ring catching the light like a tiny spotlight. She looked perfectly at ease, perfectly at home, as if she had already claimed every corner of this house in her mind. Daniel was scrolling through something on his phone, probably another listing or renovation idea, his brow furrowed in concentration. They both seemed so certain, so confident that the path ahead had already been cleared of any obstacles, including me. My heart beat steadily, almost unnaturally calm, as a strange clarity settled over me like a winter frost. There was no dramatic surge of anger, no tears threatening to spill over. Instead, I felt an awareness so sharp it bordered on relief. Pieces of the past year began rearranging themselves in my memory with unsettling precision. The way Ashley had started asking questions about property taxes during Sunday dinners, the brochures for active senior communities that Daniel had casually left on the coffee table, the sudden urgency about renovating my bedroom into a more functional space. I had dismissed each moment as concern, as modern practicality, as the inevitable shift that comes when children build lives of their own. Now those fragments clicked together into a picture I could no longer ignore. A floorboard creaked under my weight, and I held my breath, but their conversation didn't pause. They were already too absorbed in a future that didn't include the woman standing just outside the room. I glanced down at my hands, the faint blue veins beneath thinning skin, the gold wedding band I still wore even though Thomas had been gone 3 years. He used to say this house was our greatest achievement, not because of its square footage or its tidy front lawn, but because it was filled with the sound of a life well lived. I wondered what he would think now, knowing that the very walls we had painted together were being measured for their resale value. The grandfather clock in the living room chimed the half hour, its deep, familiar notes grounding me in the present. I straightened my shoulders, smoothing the front of my cardigan as if preparing to step onto a stage. If they wanted to believe I was frail, forgetful, easily persuaded, I would let them. Some battles are not won with raised voices or slammed doors. Some require patience, careful listening, and the quiet strength that only comes from having survived more storms than anyone realizes. I reached for the light switch again, this time with intention, and flicked it on, flooding the hallway with brightness before stepping forward to join them, my smile already in place like a well-practiced disguise. I carried the serving platter into the dining room with steady hands, the roasted chicken arranged just the way Thomas used to like it, golden skin crisp under the soft glow of the overhead light, rosemary sprigs tucked neatly along the edges as if presentation alone could still hold a family together. Daniel looked up from his phone and smiled in a way that almost convinced me nothing had changed, as if I had not been standing in the hallway moments earlier listening to my future being reduced to a practical inconvenience. Ashley rose from her chair with effortless grace and came toward me, her perfume light and expensive, something floral that did not quite belong in a house that still smelled faintly of furniture polish and old books. She kissed my cheek and thanked me for dinner with a warmth so carefully measured that it felt rehearsed. I set the platter down and took my seat at the head of the table, the same place I had occupied for more than 40 years, though suddenly it felt less like a position of belonging and more like a temporary assignment that could be revoked at any moment. The clink of silverware filled the silence as we began to eat, and I found myself studying their faces with a calm curiosity I did not recognize in myself. Daniel talked about work, about a potential promotion that might require longer hours, about how the housing market was surprisingly strong for early spring. Ashley nodded in all the right places, occasionally adding a comment about open floor plans or resale value, words that now sounded like coded messages meant only for the two of them. I chewed slowly, tasting very little, focusing instead on the rhythm of the moment, the way Ashley's eyes flicked around the room as if mentally rearranging the furniture, the way Daniel avoided looking directly at the framed photographs on the sideboard. There was one of him at 8 years old holding a baseball glove too big for his hand, another of our last family vacation in Cape Cod where the wind had tangled my hair and Thomas had laughed until tears streamed down his face. I wondered if they saw those memories as sentimental clutter, something that could be boxed up and stored in a climate-controlled unit, once I had been relocated somewhere more convenient. "You really should not be doing all this cooking by yourself," Ashley said lightly after a while, gesturing toward the spread as though it were evidence of poor judgment. "It must be exhausting to keep up with a house this size." Her tone was sweet, almost concerned, but the words landed with the dull weight of inevitability. Daniel nodded, cutting his chicken into precise, careful pieces. He began talking about senior living communities he had read about online, places with walking trails and game nights and transportation services, his voice adopting the patient cadence of someone explaining a necessary adjustment. I listened without interrupting, folding my napkin more neatly in my lap, allowing the conversation to wash over me like distant radio static. A part of me drifted back to the morning, to the quiet kitchen filled with pale sunlight and the hum of the refrigerator, to the way I had stood at the sink watching a pair of sparrows argue over crumbs on the back porch railing. Life had felt fragile even then, balanced on the edge of something unnamed. Now the outline of that something had come into focus, sharp and undeniable. When Daniel finally asked what I thought about downsizing, I met his eyes and smiled in a way that surprised us both. I told him it was wise to plan ahead, that change was part of growing older, that I trusted him to make decisions with my best interests at heart. The relief that flickered across his face was almost tender, as if he had been bracing for resistance he no longer needed to manage. Ashley reached for his hand under the table, their fingers intertwining in a silent celebration of progress. I excused myself after dessert, carrying my untouched coffee into the living room where the grandfather clock ticked with steady authority, marking time in a language older than any of us. Outside, the last light of day softened the outlines of the maple trees Thomas had planted decades ago, their branches just beginning to show the promise of new leaves. I sank into my armchair and let the quiet settle around me, feeling something shift deep within my chest. Fear had been replaced by resolve, grief by a careful kind of awareness. They believed the story of this house was already written, that my chapter was nearing its natural conclusion. I reached for the small leather notebook I had started keeping after Thomas passed away, flipping to a blank page as the clock chimed the hour. For the first time in a very long while, I was not thinking about how to preserve the past. I was thinking about how to shape what came next. The next morning arrived with a thin layer of fog clinging to the front yard, softening the edges of everything I thought I understood about my life. I stood at the kitchen window holding my coffee long after it had gone cold, watching the street slowly come into focus as the sun climbed higher. A delivery truck rumbled past, a jogger in bright blue sneakers waved politely, and somewhere down the block a dog barked with the same steady insistence it had shown every morning for years. Ordinary sounds. Ordinary movement. Yet inside the house the air felt different, charged with the quiet awareness that something had shifted and would never shift back. I moved through the rooms with deliberate calm, straightening the throw blanket on the couch, dusting the polished surface of the piano Thomas used to play on Sunday afternoons, pausing to touch the small chip in the banister where Daniel had once crashed his toy truck during a particularly enthusiastic race. Every object carried a memory, and for the first time I began to consider which of those memories truly belonged to me, and which had been unconsciously handed over to the future Daniel and Ashley were already designing. In the study, I opened the drawer where Thomas kept his paperwork, the faint scent of cedar still lingering from the lining he had insisted on installing himself. Inside were neatly labeled folders, insurance policies, tax returns, the deed to the house folded with meticulous care. My fingers traced the familiar signatures, the dates marking milestones of a life built brick by brick, decision by decision. I remembered the night we signed the closing documents, sitting across from a real estate agent in a cramped office that smelled like burnt coffee and copier toner, Thomas squeezing my hand under the table, as if we were embarking on the grandest adventure imaginable. Back then, the mortgage payment had seemed impossibly large, a number that kept me awake more than once at 3 in the morning. We had managed anyway. We always had. I carried the folder to the dining room and spread the papers across the table where Daniel and Ashley had sat just hours earlier discussing square footage, as though it were a simple equation. Sunlight poured through the bay window, illuminating every line of text with unforgiving clarity. There were details I had not reviewed in years, clauses about ownership rights, survivorship provisions, annotations Thomas had made in the margins with his precise handwriting. A faint unease stirred in my chest as I noticed a recent envelope tucked beneath the stack, postmarked only 2 weeks ago. It contained a copy of a document requesting information about a potential transfer of authority, a form that bore Daniel's name in the section marked interested party. I lowered myself into the chair slowly, the wood cool beneath my palms, and read each sentence twice to be certain I was not misinterpreting the language. Outside, the fog had lifted completely, revealing the tidy symmetry of our maple trees and the freshly mowed lawn of the neighbors across the street. Life was continuing at its usual pace, unaware of the quiet storm gathering inside these walls. I thought about Ashley's gentle suggestions, about Daniel's carefully chosen words, about the ease with which they had assumed I would simply follow the path they had mapped out for me. The realization did not come as a sharp shock but as a gradual tightening, like the slow turning of a key in a lock I had not known existed. I gathered the papers into a neat pile, aligning the edges with more precision than necessary, and returned them to the cedar drawer. Then I walked upstairs to my bedroom, the one Thomas and I had shared for 4 decades, and opened the closet where his suit still hung in quiet rows. I rested my forehead against the cool fabric of his favorite navy jacket, and allowed myself a single steady breath before stepping back into the hallway. On the dresser sat the leather notebook I had carried with me from the living room the night before. I opened it and began to write, not about betrayal or fear, but about possibilities, about questions that needed answers, about the importance of understanding the rules of a game before choosing how to play it. When the phone rang just after noon, Daniel's name glowing on the screen, I let it ring twice before answering, my voice even and warm as I asked how his morning had been. Daniel sounded cheerful on the phone, the way people do when they believe everything is unfolding according to plan. He asked if I had thought more about what we discussed at dinner, his voice carrying that careful balance of concern and persuasion that now felt strangely transparent. I told him I had been considering my options, that I appreciated how much he worried about my well-being, and I meant it in a way he would never fully understand. When the call ended, I sat for a long time at the kitchen table listening to the faint hum of the dishwasher and the ticking of the wall clock above the pantry door. Time had always moved quietly in this house, marking birthdays, school mornings, late-night conversations, the steady rhythm of a life that once felt anchored and predictable. Now each passing minute seemed to carry its own question. I finished my coffee, rinsed the cup, and reached for my coat with a sense of purpose that surprised me. The air outside was cool and sharp, the kind of early spring chill that lingers even when the sun promises warmer days ahead. I walked the 3 blocks to the small law office on Maple Avenue where Thomas and I had once updated our will, my steps measured but firm, as if I were following a path I had known all along. The bell above the door chimed softly when I entered, releasing the familiar scent of paper and polished wood. Mrs. Reynolds sat behind the reception desk, her silver-framed glasses perched low on her nose, and she greeted me with a warmth that felt entirely different from the polite affection I had grown used to at home. While I waited, I studied the framed diplomas on the wall, the neat rows of legal books whose titles promised clarity and structure in a world that had suddenly become uncertain. When Mr. Reynolds appeared, his handshake was steady and reassuring, the kind that invites honesty without demanding it. I explained that I wanted to review my documents, that I had questions about ownership, about authority, about the quiet ways decisions could be made without the full understanding of the person most affected by them. He listened without interruption, his expression thoughtful rather than alarmed, and when he finally spoke it was with the calm precision of someone accustomed to navigating delicate situations. We went through each page together, line by line, the legal language unfolding into meaning that felt both sobering and strangely empowering. I learned things I had not realized I had forgotten, protections Thomas had insisted on, provisions designed to ensure that this house would remain mine for as long as I wished to live within its walls. There were also recent inquiries, formal but incomplete, attempts to initiate processes that required my explicit consent before they could move forward. As Mr. Reynolds explained the implications, I felt the last remnants of confusion give way to a clearer understanding of the landscape I now stood upon. Outside the office window, traffic moved steadily along Maple Avenue, people hurrying toward appointments and errands, unaware that in this quiet room an older woman was rediscovering the boundaries of her own life. When I stepped back onto the sidewalk, the sun had climbed high enough to warm my face, and for a moment I closed my eyes, letting the light settle over me like a promise. I stopped at the corner bakery on my way home and bought a small lemon tart, something Daniel had always loved as a boy, and the gesture made me smile at the complexity of memory. Love does not disappear simply because it is tested. It changes shape, sometimes into something sharper and more watchful. Back in the house, I set the tart on the kitchen counter and opened my leather notebook again, adding new lines beneath the questions I had written the night before. There were practical steps to consider now, conversations to plan, choices to make with care rather than haste. The grandfather clock chimed 3 times, its deep notes echoing through the hallway like a steady heartbeat. I realized then that this was not merely about protecting a piece of property or resisting an unwanted move. It was about reclaiming the quiet authority I had once assumed would always be understood. When the front doorbell rang unexpectedly just before dusk, I wiped my hands on a dish towel and went to answer it, already sensing that the next chapter was approaching faster than anyone in this house had anticipated. When I opened the front door, I found Mrs. Eleanor Parker standing on the porch with a covered casserole dish balanced carefully in her hands, the steam curling faintly into the cool evening air. She had lived across the street for nearly 20 years, long enough to have watched Daniel grow from a restless teenager into a man with responsibilities he sometimes carried like borrowed luggage. Her kind blue eyes searched my face as if she already sensed the subtle tremor beneath my calm. "I made too much," she said with a gentle smile, the kind that does not require explanation. I stepped aside to let her in, grateful for the familiar comfort of her presence, the soft rustle of her coat brushing against the hallway wall where Thomas had once hung framed postcards from our road trips. We settled in the kitchen, the overhead light casting a warm circle around the small wooden table that had held countless cups of coffee and late-night conversations. She spoke about ordinary things at first, about the new couple who had moved into the yellow house on the corner, about the city planning to repave Maple Avenue before summer, about how the daffodils in her garden were blooming earlier than usual this year. I listened, nodding at the right moments, feeling the tension in my shoulders loosen just enough to breathe more freely. Then she placed her fork down and met my eyes with a seriousness that shifted the atmosphere entirely. She mentioned that she had seen a real estate agent parked outside my house earlier that week, a man with a clipboard measuring the width of the driveway and taking notes about the condition of the roof. She assumed I was preparing to sell, she said, her tone careful but unmistakably concerned. For a moment I simply stared at her, the words settling into place with the quiet certainty of something I had already suspected. I told her I had not invited anyone to assess the property, that any such plans would have been mine to share. The silence that followed felt both heavy and clarifying. Outside, a car drove past with its radio playing faintly through an open window, the distant music a reminder that life continued beyond the boundaries of my front yard. Mrs. Parker reached across the table and touched my hand, her grip firm in a way that spoke of solidarity rather than pity. She reminded me that this neighborhood had watched over one another through storms and celebrations alike, that no one was truly alone unless they chose to be. Her words lingered long after she left, the casserole now cooling on the counter beside the untouched lemon tart. I carried both dishes into the refrigerator with deliberate care, closing the door softly as if sealing away more than just leftovers. Later that evening, I walked through the house room by room, noticing details I had overlooked for years. The faint scratch on the dining table where Daniel had done his homework with too much enthusiasm, the slight tilt of the bookshelf Thomas had always meant to fix, the way the hallway light flickered for a second before settling into a steady glow. These imperfections felt like quiet witnesses, holding the truth of a life that could not be reduced to market value or convenience. In the study, I sat at the desk and opened my notebook once more, adding Mrs. Parker's observation to the growing list of facts that were shaping my understanding. There was a difference between suspicion and confirmation, and I was beginning to cross that invisible line. The house seemed to listen as I wrote, its familiar creaks and sighs forming a language of their own. When the clock struck 9, I brewed a cup of chamomile tea and stood by the back window watching the moon rise above the maple trees, its pale light outlining the branches like delicate lace. Somewhere in the distance a train whistle sounded long and low, carrying the promise of movement and change. I realized then that whatever Daniel and Ashley believed about my future, they had underestimated the depth of roots that run through a place built on patience and memory. I closed the notebook and turned off the kitchen light, letting the darkness settle gently around me, not as a threat but as a quiet companion to the plans forming steadily in my mind. The following morning arrived with a quiet determination that felt different from the careful awareness of the previous days, as if something inside me had finally chosen a direction. Woke before sunrise and moved through the familiar rituals of the house with deliberate grace, opening the curtains to let the pale light spill across the living room rug Thomas and I had picked out together during a clearance sale more than 20 years ago. The air still carried the faint scent of chamomile from the night before, mingling with the sharper aroma of fresh coffee, as it brewed in the old machine that hummed like a loyal companion. I sat at the kitchen table with my notebook open, reviewing the details I had gathered, the unexpected visit from the real estate agent, the incomplete request for authority, the quiet reassurance from Mr. Reynolds about the legal protections already in place. Each fact rested on the page like a small stone, and together they formed a path I could finally see. By mid-morning I found myself standing in the hallway outside Daniel's old bedroom, now used mostly for storage, the door slightly ajar. Sunlight filtered through the dusty blinds, illuminating boxes of forgotten school projects, and a stack of photo albums I had not opened in years. I stepped inside and ran my fingers along the edge of a shelf where his trophies still stood, plastic figures frozen in victory. It struck me how easily time can transform symbols of pride into relics no one remembers to dust. That realization carried me back downstairs with renewed clarity. I picked up the phone and called the bank, my voice steady as I requested copies of recent account activity and confirmation of any inquiries made on my behalf. The young woman on the line spoke politely, unaware that her routine responses were helping me draw the boundaries of a quiet defense. When I hung up, I felt the faintest echo of the confidence Thomas used to have when solving practical problems, the kind that required patience rather than confrontation. The afternoon passed in measured tasks. I sorted through drawers, organizing documents into neat folders labeled in my own handwriting, replacing uncertainty with order. Outside, the neighborhood carried on with its ordinary rhythm. Children riding bicycles along the sidewalk, the distant whine of a lawn mower, a delivery driver setting a package on the Parker's porch. The simplicity of those scenes grounded me, reminding me that while plans might be forming behind closed doors, the world itself remained indifferent to private dramas. Around 4 o'clock, my phone chimed with a message from Ashley asking if she and Daniel could stop by later in the week to discuss wedding arrangements and some practical matters about the house. I read her words twice, noting the polite phrasing, the casual assumption that access would be granted without question. I responded with equal politeness, suggesting a time that suited me, my fingers hovering for a moment before pressing send. It was a small act, but it felt like the first move in a game I was beginning to understand. As evening settled, I took a slow walk around the property, tracing the outline of the garden Thomas had planted with such optimism. The maple trees whispered softly in the breeze, their branches brushing against one another like old friends sharing secrets. I paused by the garage where faint chalk marks still lingered from Daniel's childhood attempts to measure his height against the passing years. Standing there, I realized that the house had never simply been a structure of wood and brick. It was a record of endurance, of choices made with faith rather than certainty. When I returned inside, I locked the doors with a deliberate click that echoed through the quiet rooms. In the study, I placed the newly organized folders into the cedar drawer and closed it gently, as if sealing a promise. The leather notebook lay open on the desk, its pages filling with observations that no one else would ever see until I chose to reveal them. I wrote one final line before turning off the lamp, a sentence about timing and the importance of letting others believe they are ahead. Somewhere beyond the darkened windows, a train passed again, its distant rumble steady and purposeful, carrying the sense that movement, once begun, cannot easily be reversed. The day they were supposed to visit arrived wrapped in a pale gray sky that threatened rain but never quite delivered, as if even the weather had chosen to linger in uncertainty. I spent the morning moving through the house with quiet intention, polishing the dining table until its surface reflected the light like still water, arranging fresh tulips in the glass vase Daniel had given me one Mother's Day when he was still young enough to believe gestures could fix everything. There was a calmness in my movements now that felt less like resignation and more like preparation. At exactly 2 p.m, their car pulled into the driveway, tires crunching softly over the gravel Thomas had insisted on laying himself one summer long ago. I watched from the front window as Daniel stepped out first, adjusting his jacket with the same nervous habit he had as a teenager before a school presentation. Ashley followed, her posture confident, her smile already in place as though she were arriving at a carefully staged performance. When I opened the door, the scent of her perfume drifted in ahead of her, bright and polished, a contrast to the familiar warmth of cinnamon and coffee that filled my hallway. We exchanged greetings that felt perfectly ordinary to anyone listening from a distance. They complimented the flowers, admired the cleanliness of the living room, asked about my health with voices tuned to just the right pitch of concern. I led them to the dining table where the documents I had chosen to leave in plain sight rested in neat, deliberate stacks. Daniel's gaze flickered toward them before he quickly looked away, as if pretending not to notice would make them disappear. Ashley began speaking about wedding venues and guest lists, her words flowing smoothly, weaving practical matters with gentle reminders about the future they were building together. I listened with a composed expression, nodding at appropriate moments, allowing her confidence to expand until it filled the room. Eventually Daniel cleared his throat and shifted the conversation toward housing arrangements, mentioning how difficult it must be for me to maintain such a large property alone. He spoke about safety, about community, about opportunities for social engagement, each phrase polished by repetition. I folded my hands on the table and asked thoughtful questions, encouraging him to explain further, watching the subtle relief in his shoulders as he believed he was finally being understood. Outside, a single drop of rain struck the window and slid slowly downward, leaving a faint trail like a quiet signature. I rose to make tea, giving them a moment alone, and as I stood at the stove I heard their voices drop into the hushed urgency of conspirators convinced they were on the verge of success. The kettle began to whistle softly, its rising tone blending with the distant sound of a passing bus, and I felt an unexpected sense of gratitude for the clarity unfolding around me. When I returned with the tray, Daniel was studying the photographs on the wall, his expression unreadable. Ashley reached for her cup with practiced elegance, thanking me with the same sweetness that now sounded almost mechanical. We spoke for nearly an hour, circling the subject without ever naming it directly, until I finally opened one of the folders and slid a document toward them. The legal language lay there in black and white, calm and authoritative, outlining protections neither of them had fully anticipated. I did not raise my voice or accuse them of anything. I simply invited them to read. The silence that followed felt vast, stretching from the polished surface of the table to the ticking clock in the hallway. Daniel's eyes moved slowly across the page, confusion giving way to dawning comprehension. Ashley's smile faltered for the first time since she arrived, replaced by a careful neutrality that revealed more than any protest could have. In that moment, I understood that control does not always belong to the person who speaks the loudest or plans the furthest ahead. Sometimes it rests quietly with the one who has learned to listen, to wait, to gather the pieces of truth until they form a shield no one else can see. When they finally looked up, searching my face for emotion they could recognize, I offered them the same steady smile I had practiced for days. A reminder that the story of this house was not yet finished, and that its next chapter would be written on my terms. They did not stay much longer after that. Daniel folded the document with slow, careful movements as if the act itself might change the meaning of the words printed on the page, while Ashley placed her untouched teacup back onto the saucer with a faint click that echoed louder than it should have in the quiet room. Their departure was polite, almost ceremonious, the kind of goodbye exchanged by people who understand that something irreversible has taken place but have not yet decided how to respond to it. I watched from the window as their car reversed down the driveway and disappeared around the corner, the tulips on the table catching the fading light like small flames refusing to go out. When the house settled back into its familiar stillness, I carried the empty cups to the sink and rinsed them slowly, allowing the steady rush of warm water to anchor me in the present. Outside, the rain that had threatened all afternoon finally began to fall, tapping softly against the glass in a rhythm that felt almost contemplative. I moved through the rooms with an awareness sharpened by everything that had just unfolded, noticing how the shadows shifted across the hallway floor, how the grandfather clock continued its patient counting of seconds as though nothing remarkable had occurred. Yet beneath that surface calm, I sensed a new current running through the house, a quiet momentum that belonged entirely to me. In the study, I opened the cedar drawer and removed the folder Mr. Reynolds had helped me review, spreading the pages across the desk once more. There were additional steps to take, small but decisive actions that would ensure no misunderstanding could ever again place my future in someone else's hands. I picked up the phone and scheduled another appointment, this time to finalize an arrangement Thomas had once mentioned in passing during a late-night conversation about security and independence. Back then I had smiled at his caution, convinced that love within a family was protection enough. Now I understood the wisdom behind his foresight with a clarity that felt both humbling and empowering. The next morning I returned to the law office, the same bell chiming above the door, the same scent of paper and polished wood greeting me like an old acquaintance. Mr. Reynolds listened as I explained what I wanted to do, his nods measured, his questions precise. Together we completed the paperwork to place the house into an irrevocable trust that would remain solely under my control for as long as I lived, a safeguard that transformed intention into certainty. When I signed my name at the bottom of the final page, the pen felt unexpectedly light in my hand, as though the act of writing had lifted a weight I had not fully acknowledged. Outside, the sky had cleared into a wide expanse of pale blue, the kind that appears after rain has washed every doubt from the air. I walked home at an unhurried pace, stopping to admire the daffodils in Mrs. Parker's garden, and exchanging a brief wave with the mail carrier who had delivered letters to this address for nearly 3 decades. These small interactions felt like threads reconnecting me to a life that was still very much my own. That evening Daniel called again, his voice careful, searching for a tone that might bridge the distance now stretching between us. He spoke about stress, about misunderstandings, about how difficult it was to balance new responsibilities with old loyalties. I listened without interrupting, offering simple reassurances that revealed nothing of the decisions already set in motion. After we hung up, I opened my leather notebook and added a final note beneath the others, a sentence about patience and the quiet strength of preparation. The rain had left the air cool and fragrant, and as I stepped onto the back porch I could hear the distant whistle of the evening train cutting through the twilight. Its steady passage reminded me that journeys continue whether or not we feel ready for them. Standing there, watching the last light fade beyond the maple trees, I realized that the story unfolding within these walls was no longer defined by fear of what might be taken away. It was guided instead by the certainty of what I had chosen to protect, and by the calm understanding that sometimes the greatest victories are the ones no one sees coming until it is far too late to change their course. The weeks that followed unfolded with a quiet precision that only I seemed to notice, as if time itself had begun moving in alignment with the decisions I had already made. Spring settled fully over the neighborhood, painting the maple trees with soft green leaves and filling the mornings with the sound of distant lawn mowers and children waiting for school buses. From the outside my life appeared unchanged. I still watered the garden before breakfast, still waved to Mrs. Parker as she collected her newspaper, still baked on Sundays because the rhythm of old habits can be as comforting as any promise. Yet beneath that familiar routine, something steadier had taken root inside me. Daniel called more often now, his voice carrying an uncertainty he tried to disguise with forced enthusiasm. Ashley sent polite messages about wedding plans and floral arrangements, her words carefully measured, as though she were testing the ground before stepping forward again. I responded with kindness that was genuine but no longer unquestioning. There is a difference between love that protects and love that surrenders, and I had finally learned to recognize. One afternoon, an elegant invitation arrived in the mail, cream-colored cardstock etched in gold, announcing their engagement celebration at a country club on the edge of town. I ran my fingers over the embossed lettering and felt an unexpected calm. Thomas used to say that important moments reveal more truth than ordinary days ever could, and I suspected he would have recognized this one immediately. I chose a navy dress from the back of my closet, the same one I had worn to our 40th anniversary dinner, and paired it with the pearl earrings he had given me the year Daniel graduated from college. When I arrived at the club, sunlight glinted off rows of parked cars, and the sound of laughter drifted across the manicured lawn. Inside, crystal glasses chimed softly and conversations flowed like music, creating the illusion of effortless happiness. Daniel greeted me with a careful embrace, relief flickering across his face when he realized I had come alone. Ashley's smile was bright and composed, her eyes scanning my expression as though searching for signs she could interpret. I congratulated them sincerely, allowing the warmth of the moment to exist without contradiction. During the speeches, I stood near a window overlooking the golf course, watching a distant group of players move methodically from one green to the next. Their measured progress reminded me of the way plans unfold when patience guides each step. Eventually, Daniel approached me with 2 glasses of sparkling water, his voice low as he spoke about starting fresh, about learning from misunderstandings, about building a future that included everyone. I listened, noting the subtle shift in his posture, the humility that had replaced earlier certainty. Without drama or accusation, I told him that some futures are stronger when they are built on truth rather than assumption, that independence is not rejection but a form of respect. Later in the evening, as guests gathered around a grand piano and Ashley laughed at something a friend had said, I slipped a small envelope into Daniel's hand. Inside was a copy of the finalized trust document, along with a brief note written in my own steady script. I had not come to humiliate or to triumph. I had come to make something unmistakably clear. He read it quietly, the color draining slightly from his cheeks before he looked up at me with an expression that held both regret and dawning understanding. I placed my hand over his for a moment, the way I had when he was a child facing a difficult lesson, and then I stepped away to join the others. The music swelled, glasses clinked, and the celebration continued around us as though nothing had changed. Yet I knew that everything had. When I returned home that night, the house welcomed me with its familiar stillness, the grandfather clock marking the hour with patient authority. I hung my coat in the hallway and walked to the back porch, where the cool night air carried the distant sound of the evening train once more. Its steady passage felt like a quiet affirmation that journeys can lead back to oneself, if one is willing to walk them with courage. Standing there beneath the wide American sky, I realized that the greatest victory was not keeping the house or proving a point. It was rediscovering the strength to define my own life without apology, to let others learn that respect cannot be arranged like furniture or negotiated over dinner. Some lessons arrive softly, wrapped in silence and steady resolve. And sometimes by the time they are understood, the future has already changed direction.